Want to get into the plant hobby but don't really know which plants to avoid? Well, today I'm going to be recommending my top 5 plants that I would recommend not buying as a beginner. One of the problems is when you go to the nursery and it's your first time getting into the plant hobby, you're met with an absolutely huge variety of plants at the nursery. They're all very beautiful and colorful and they're all very different from each other. And when you don't really know much of anything about plants at all, it's very easy to buy plants that more or less look pretty but aren't really practical for you. So we're going to be talking about some of those plants that I would just not recommend you take home as a beginner. Probably one of the most common plants that people end up buying as their first plant is the Calathea. This is because Calatheas are very common. Every nursery carries multiple species of them. They're more or less a very pretty and colorful plant. They come in a lot of different patterns and variegations, and they're not too expensive either. So at first glance, they look like a great plant to take home, but that is essentially a trap.
It's a trap!
Especially for a new time plant keeper. While a Calathea might seem fine in your home for a short period of time, after 6 months or so, or maybe a year even, you might notice it start to get brown and crispy leaves. This is because where these plants originate from, they come from where there's very high humidity in the air. The humidity of your home generally won't meet their humidity requirements at a long-term period. So if you're one of those lucky people that live in a very high humidity type of place, you live in a more tropical country, this might not apply to you. You may be able to keep Calatheas quite successfully, but for the most part, most people living in a more average humidity, I guess you would say, like around say 40% or so on average, are going to struggle with Calathea. Even the humidity aside, they don't like chlorine, and generally tap water has chlorine in it, at least in most places. Tap water has chlorine. You need to remove chlorine from the tap water to keep Calathea. Chlorine in the tap water will also cause their leaves to go brown and crispy as well. You can use water conditioner, which you use for aquariums, to remove the chlorine, but still, like I was saying, they're generally not a beginner's plant. However, if you really do have your heart set on keeping a Calathea as your first plant, there are 2 varieties that are just a little bit easier than the others. First one is a Calathea eldergrass. This one is actually a bit more resilient than most other Calatheas. You still might get some browning leaves. You still do need to use water conditioner to remove chlorine from the tap water, because that's just something that happens to all Calathea anyway. Chlorine browns their leaves regardless of the species, but the Calathea eldergrass, it seems to be a bit more resilient than most other Calatheas. The other one is the Calathea makoyana, also known as the peacock Calathea. These have a more typical Calathea look to them with the variegations and the striping, but I have found they're also just a little bit easier to keep than most other Calathea species. So with the exception of those 2 species, honestly, I'd say give Calatheas a bit of a miss. I get it, they're pretty, they're not too expensive. But you're gonna most likely be pulling your hair out in 6 months to a year when they just keep getting all these crispy leaves and there's nothing you can do to stop it. So even though Calathea are an absolutely beautiful plant, they're also an absolute prima donna, and they'll throw a hissy fit every time they get slightly upset with something in your home. So for the most part, I would say just keep moving from Calathea and move on to a different species of plant. Next plant is the Alocasia. Now I absolutely love Alocasias. They're one of my favorite plants. I have quite a decent collection of them at this point. I have been keeping them a very long time, so I've gotten kind of the hang of what they need and how to keep them properly. But for a beginner, I personally wouldn't recommend Alocasia. They can be a bit fussy and finicky with certain things. As a whole, they're not actually that difficult to keep. It's just, they're not the most rewarding plant. They often don't put out too many leaves. Alocasia might produce 1 leaf every now and again, and oftentimes as the newest leaf is unfurling, the oldest leaf will fall off. This means most Alocasias are limited on the amount of leaves they can have at any given time. This does vary depending on how you're caring for them and the conditions they're living in as well. That all affects how many leaves they can sustain at any given time, but generally they kind of max out at a certain size in your home, and that's really it. So they're not the most rewarding. That aside, they're very prone to spider mites, and most beginners probably don't even realize what spider mites are, or even if they've heard of them, they don't really know how to spot them or fix them. So spider mites are extremely small, and often you don't even notice them on your plant until you look closely at the leaf and notice a very wispy webbing kind of between the leaves, usually on the underside of the leaf or on the top of the leaf between the V of the leaf, which is what alocasias have. They have a V in their leaf. So they're very prone to spider mites. You do kind of have to treat them proactively every so often just to keep the spider mites at bay. Going back to them not being the most rewarding plant, most of the time, unless you're living in a very tropical climate, alocasia will go dormant in winter. This means they will completely die back to a bulb, and you essentially just have a pot of dirt.
Look what I got. I got a jar of dirt. I got a jar of dirt. And guess what's inside it?
For the winter. So you don't really have any plant to look at and enjoy during the winter period. Best case scenario, they might just lose some of their leaves and hang on to 1, 2, maybe 3 leaves during winter, and they don't really grow at all. But a lot of the time they do just die completely back, and you have to wait until spring and then they regrow. So provided you're willing to put up with them going dormant and potentially dying in winter down to nothing, and you want to deal with spider mites as an on and off consistent thing, you can, I suppose, give alocasias a go, but they're not really what I would recommend for someone to keep as their first time plant. But if you really wanted an alocasia as your first time plant, regardless of all this, if you're happy to put up with spider mites every now and again and you're okay with them going potentially dormant in winter, I would probably recommend either an Alocasia zebrina or an Elephant alocasia. They're one of the easier ones to keep that I've found. I've kept many of them over the years, and compared to various other species, they do tend to be a little more resilient. They don't tend to die back so much in winter, not as much as the other ones at least. So yeah, they're a little bit easier. They're still just as prone to spider mites though, so yeah, that's just always going to be something you've got to worry about. But otherwise, they're not too bad if you really wanted to try one. Next plant to avoid as a beginner would be the Venus flytrap. And look, I fully understand why people are attracted to these. As a plant, they're pretty cool. Just the fact they can catch insects and you can visibly see them opening and closing their little traps to catch the insects that walk into them. That's really cool. But that's kind of where the novelty wears off with them, I've found. Firstly, these are a bog plant. They live in permanently wet mud and soil, so they're not gonna be living in your typical houseplant style of conditions where you're just watering them once every week or so. They need to be kept permanently wet, so you can't let them dry out at all. They need very high lighting, but not direct sun. They don't like nutrients at all, so they have to be kept in a completely inert soil. So something like cocoa peat or sphagnum moss is great. Something that's completely inert, meaning no nutrients, and also something that's acidic. So a substrate that releases tannins, like cocoa peat. Cocoa peat releases tannins. Tannins lower the pH of the soil, making it acidic. This is what these plants need. This is also why they've evolved to trap insects, and that's how they get their nutrients, because they live in very nutrient deprived soil in nature. They have to catch insects to get their nutrients that way. On top of this, they're also another plant that doesn't like chlorine or minerals. Tap water in most countries has chlorine in it, and it also has minerals, which is total dissolved solids, or TDS for short. So there might be a bit of sodium or magnesium or potassium or something like that in your tap water. Venus flytraps don't like minerals, so you would need to water them with reverse osmosis water, or at the least tap water with water conditioner to remove the chlorine. But in terms of removing the minerals, the only way to do that is to use reverse osmosis water. You can either buy it from the supermarket in a bottled form, or you can install a filtration system on your tap to remove all the minerals. As if this doesn't sound like too much trouble already to keep them alive, these are also a plant that for the most part dies in winter. They will completely die off to virtually nothing, and you'll just have again a pot of soil throughout winter, and they come back again in spring provided they're still alive under the soil. So again, not very rewarding, because for at least a quarter of the year they're not really there, and then throughout the time they're alive, they're just kind of, I don't know, demanding and hard to keep alive as well. It's also recommended to not make them open and close their little traps. I know it's kind of fun to see the traps open and close all the time, but every time you make them close their trap and there's no food in there, they eventually end up kind of digesting their own trap, because when it closes, it expects an insect. It'll release digestive enzymes to digest said insect. If there's nothing in there, it ends up kind of digesting itself over time. So it's not really good. So it's not really recommended to poke and prod them to make them open and close, even though that might seem fun. Don't do it. So next one on the list is philodendrons with velvety leaves. So I understand this is kind of a broad way of saying this, but there's a lot of different varieties out there. But for example, like your Philodendron gloriosum or Philodendron micans. The bigger leafed ones I've found are a bit harder, but generally I've found most velvety leaved philodendrons are very hard to keep compared to their glossy leafed counterpart. Mainly because they have trouble unfurling their new leaves. Now, this could be just a me problem, but from what I've found, I've kept a lot of them over the years, and at one point or another, they eventually reach a point where they'll put up a new leaf and it starts to unfurl, and then it gets stuck and it just stops. And if it does eventually unfurl, it's deformed or ripped or half dried up. And I've put it down to a humidity problem. They need high humidity to unfurl their new leaves successfully. The new leaves are very tissue paper thin and are easily torn and easily dried out when they're in that state. So if the air around them gets even slightly too dry when they're in that process, they often just get stuck. When I had a big gloriosum, I had to mist the leaf constantly until it unfurled. Otherwise, it would end up pretty much deformed, or it'd rip, or it'd just dry up and shrivel up into nothing and never like become anything. And this goes for like your Philodendron micans, though it's not as prone because it's much smaller, so I guess it's not as much effort or time to unfurl a leaf. But a lot of your bigger varieties generally have this issue. However, this doesn't necessarily mean you can't keep philodendrons, just not the velvety type ones if you want to avoid that headache, potentially. There's lots of philodendron species with glossy leaves, whether that be a climbing variety of philodendron, like your Philodendron Brazil or your heartleaf philodendron, or you can get much larger tree type philodendrons, like your split leaf philodendron or your sun red philodendron. There's many different varieties out there. So I'm not saying don't get philodendrons, just honestly try and avoid the velvety ones if possible. Another plant to avoid would be the asparagus fern. Now, these are kind of a cool plant when you look at them. They're very interesting looking, and I would love to be able to keep them long term, but I just cannot do it. They always get crispy, and this is because I guess I have a pretty busy lifestyle, so I sometimes might miss the odd watering here and there, and ferns just can't have that at all. Ferns generally need to be kept slightly damp at all times. And any direct sun as well, they'll burn extremely quickly compared to most other plants. So they're not something you can kind of ignore at all, even for a short period of time. So for that reason, I'll say asparagus ferns, definitely avoid them if you're not willing to kind of baby the plant and tend to it all the time. This doesn't necessarily mean ferns are completely off the table. If you wanted a fern, I think the closest fern that looks like an asparagus fern, kind of, that's much easier, would be the rabbit's foot fern. They aren't as prone to drying out as quickly because they have thick rhizomes that store a lot of water. So they can kind of deal with you missing the odd watering here and there. They are still a fern. They prefer lower lighting opposed to bright light or even direct sun they can't handle. But at least with the rabbit's foot fern, you don't have to worry about it drying out as quickly. Saying that, it's still a fern and ferns are still finicky, but out of the two, rabbit's foot seems to be the easiest one I've found. Rightio, well that's my list of the top 5 plants I would personally recommend to avoid as a beginner in the plant hobby. If you've enjoyed this video, guys, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. You can buy me a coffee down in the description if you want to donate to the channel. Until then, I'll see you next time, guys. Bye-bye.